What is up, party people? We are back today on our last biology test of the year, and today we are looking at ecosystems. Go ahead and pause for our objectives. So what is an ecosystem? An ecosystem includes all biotic and abiotic factors and their interactions within a specific space. And ecologists are the ones who study these interactions, and they do this to better understand the ecosystem as a whole as well as its individual members. There are three primary ecosystem types that can be subdivided into numerous smaller ecosystems, but the major three are the terrestrial, freshwater, and marine. Terrestrial being land, freshwater being like rivers, lakes, creeks, and then marine being saltwater, like the oceans. And then ecosystems can also vary in size. They can be tiny, like microsystems in a small puddle. They can also be very large, like biomes. Healthy ecosystems are in a state of equilibrium, meaning it's a steady state where all organisms are in balance with each other. And since natural systems are dynamic, ecologists use two different parameters in relation to equilibrium to then measure the health of ecosystems. So the first one is resistance, which is the ability of an ecosystem to remain in equilibrium despite a disturbance. So that means something happens, but it still stays in equilibrium. So think like a water bottle. How far can you, or how hard can you hit the water bottle before it completely topples over? You know, sometimes we can knock something gently and it might shake a little and then it'll go back to normal. And then resilience is the ability and speed of an ecosystem to return to equilibrium after disturbance. So this is where something has been completely destroyed, a wildfire, a flood, and the ecosystem has been wrecked. And so resilience is how quickly can it recover from that and get back to its state of equilibrium. And we'll get into what succession is later. And then if either of these is lost, then the entire ecosystem will collapse because it's not maintaining equilibrium. So when we're studying ecosystems, we look at a few different things. One are ecosystem dynamics, which is the study of how internal forces and disturbances impact an ecosystem structure. So there's the holistic approach, which is trying to represent an ecosystem as accurately as possible in its natural state. So an example would be a food web or versus a food chain. It is costly in time and money because one, you need money to put in all of this effort to create that ecosystem as closely as you can to a natural state. And then you also need a lot of time to see how things are going to mature and grow and what will happen. And then also environmental systems are controlled, and these are controlled environments that are used to test the ecological hypotheses. So you might have a hypothesis about something within an ecosystem, and so you would set up a very controlled environment to then test different variables to see if it is what you hypothesized it was that is impacting. This is where we have our dependent and independent variables. We have mesosomes, and this is where you're blocking off part of the natural environment to manipulate it for a study. So there's limited control and there is potential disturbance of the area. And then microsome, and this is a laboratory-based experiment. There's full control, limited application of results because it's not fully replicating the complexity of an ecosystem. Again, we're only testing, one thing or possibly two. We're not testing an entire ecosystem. It's not identical. And the ecosystem modelings, it's a complexity of ecosystems, and they require ecologists to utilize modeling in both their study and presentation of results. So there's the conceptual model, which is essentially trying to compartmentalize the components of an ecosystem. So this would be like a flowchart representing the interactions, and it's limited in use because it's predicting potential outcomes to the changes in an ecosystem. So it is limited in that aspect. There's the analytical model, which uses mathematic models to represent ecosystem dynamics. And this is more useful as a predictive model. So using, statistics, how likely is this to happen? And then we have a simulation model, and this is the use of a computer model to represent ecological relationships. So this is more of a holistic approach because the computer has the ability to analyze larger quantities and types of data, and it can evaluate and predict larger ecosystem relationships. Energy flow. The primary relationship studied within any ecosystem is the transfer of nutrients, so carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, and energy, the big one being energy. So when we're looking at how does energy move from one organism to the next, we're primarily going to look at a food chain, and this is a linear sequence that shows which nutrients and energy pass from one organism to the next. And then we do this also by looking at trophic levels, which show the position within a food chain an organism occupies. And nearly all food chains begin with a producer, which serves as the foundational species for that chain and potentially the entire ecosystem, because that is the organism that is being consumed by the lowest level. The plant is not consuming anything except for sunlight, and then from there it's being consumed, and that organism is consumed, and so on and so forth. And then finally, the last consumer in the food chain is considered the apex consumer, also known as the apex predator. So we think of these as wolves, bears sometimes, lions. And then also, as these levels increase, the amount of available nutrients and energy decreases. So approximately only 10% of energy is it's lost during each level. So, you're going to start out with a lot more energy closer to the bottom, with the producer being consumed by the primary consumer. So you're going to have more energy passing there than, say, you would at the top of the food chain, where you have the apex predator consuming another organism. There's less energy stored in that biomass, primarily because energy is lost in heat. Energy is also used by the organism when it's alive for metabolism, cellular respiration, all of their bodily functions, movement, waste. And so that energy is used up, and it's not all stored in the biomass, and the biomass is what is then being consumed by the predator. And so the trophic levels, I just mentioned these, but these are the levels of our food chain. So level 1 is the primary producer. That, again, this is the base. It's the organisms that produce their own energy, autotrophs. And we see this in photoautotrophs, meaning they use photosynthesis, and chemoautotrophs, which is rare, but they are still within the food chain. And we primarily see these in the hydrothermal vents, bacteria at the very bottom of the ocean, because there is no light. So they use other chemical processes to produce their own energy. And then level 2, which, stay with me now, is the primary consumer. So this is the first level of consumer. Level 1 of the trophic levels is the producer. Level 2 is the consumer. But level 2 is the primary consumer. And this is the animal that consumes the producer. Typically, we see these as herbivores, but in some ecosystems, they could also be omnivores. And then level 3 is the secondary consumer. And these are the animals that consume the primary consumer, so carnivores or omnivores. Level 4 is going to be our tertiary consumer, which consumes the secondary consumer. And then level 5 and up, we could keep going, is essentially the apex predator. It's the last consumer in the food chain, and is typically the one that is the apex predator for that entire ecosystem. And then aside from those organisms, we also have decomposers and detrivores. These are organisms that break down the dead organic matter, and they recycle the nutrients back into the ecosystem. They don't occupy a specific trophic level, and that's because eventually all of the organisms are going to break down anyway, and it'll eventually get to them. And these can also be a keystone species, and keystone species are often the primary producer or the apex consumer, and that's because if you remove them from the environment, it's going to have detrimental effects. So one example would be the wolves in Yellowstone. When you have an entire ecosystem in a food chain, what we typically see is that, say, we have grass and we have deer that eat the grass. We also have coyotes and we have wolves. Well, if you remove wolves being the primary apex predator, then not as many deer are being killed. So then the deer will overconsume the producer of the grass. And so what we see then is that there's a lack of biodiversity within our producers, because the deer are overconsuming it to stay alive and help sustain their growing populations, because nothing is consuming them and they're not dying at a fast enough rate. And so when wolves are reintroduced, then what we will see is that number will stabilize and it will go back to equilibrium. Same as a producer. You remove the producer, then the deer will die, which means the wolves have nothing to prey upon. And so that is why they're a keystone species, being that they are key to that ecosystem. So as trophic levels increase, the number of organisms that occupy each level decrease in population size, but they increase in body size. This is typically what we see. And the energy and nutrient requirements increase with body size. The larger you are, the more energy you need to maintain your homeostasis. And then food sources also decrease as you go up in levels. There's less available nutrients and energy, approximately 10% being lost at each level. And if you look to the right, it's a visual representation of what I've been talking about. So producers have 100% energy, but then only 10% goes to the primary producer, which means 1% goes to the secondary, and 0.1% goes to the tertiary, and so on and so forth, which means you need to consume more energy to sustain yourself. And organisms use nutrients and energy to grow, develop, repair, reproduce, and activity and heat loss, entropy, is the primary way that we lose this. And then again, apex consumers, they need to consume a larger quantity to reach their energy requirements. And then ecological pyramid, which is what we're seeing over here on the right, is a visual representation of the amounts of various parameters at each trophic level, so primarily energy, body mass, and number of individuals. And then a food web is a more realistic view of the consumer relationship. And this is typically what, is found in nature. So it's food chains, multiple food chains. When we're looking at a food chain, we're looking at only a single linear path of consumption and nutrient and energy transfer. But a food web, we're making all those chains into one image, which you can see on the upper right hand corner. So instead of having just a unidirectional flow, a linear flow, we're going to have berries that go to grasshoppers, butterflies, and green flies. There are a lot of different food chains, but thankfully we have arrows that will indicate the direction of the flow of energy. So the berries, their energy is going to the grasshopper, the butterfly, and the green fly, and then the green fly is going to the ladybird, and so on and so forth. And then trophic level productivity. So productivity is the portion of energy entering an ecosystem that is converted to biomass. And biomass is the total mass of living and previously living organisms within a trophic level. We have gross primary productivity, which is the amount of energy from the sun that is then converted by photosynthetic organisms, so primary producers. Net primary productivity is the amount of energy that remains after an organism has consumed its portion for its own functions, so like activities, heat loss, and then the portion available to the next trophic level, so primary consumers. Net consumer productivity is the portion of available to the next trophic level after the consumer has used its portion. And then we also have assimilation. This is where biomass is consumed and assimilated from the previous trophic level. And this is where the energy is lost due to incomplete digestion of food. Energy is used for respiration and, again, waste. Biomagnification, this is also really important. So this is where we have an increasing of a concentration of a specific substance. Usually we see this in toxins at each trophic level. It cannot be metabolized, so they are just passing this on when the organism is consumed, which results in the concentrations increasing as it moves up the food chain. An example of this was DDT. It was commonly used as a pesticide in the 1960s and 70s, and the runoff of these organisms would get into the water system or go to the plants that were near the water system, and then fish would eat those. And so then the fish would consume DDT, and then the birds that ate the fish would then consume the DDT, and this caused those birds to start laying more fragile eggs, which means they would break more easily, which then means less of that population was growing because they were dying at such an early age because their eggs were so fragile, which was detrimental to their population. And this is why it's really important that we watch what we're using, because biomagnification and bioaccumulation are dangerous. And bioaccumulation is that gradual buildup of the concentration of toxins in an individual organism over time. So again, when you're, a young fish and you're only eating a little bit of the pesticide grass, then you're not going to have as much. But as you get older and you continue to eat that, it's going to build up in your system. And moving on to biochemical cycles. So all energy is going to eventually enter and exit an ecosystem, and it's recycled through biogeochemical cycles. And this is that recycling of inorganic matter between the living organisms and their environment. So primary ones that we see: water, carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur. For the cases of this test, Mr. Mason would like us to focus on water, carbon, and nitrogen, but we will cover the ones that we need to. So starting with the water cycle, or the hydrologic cycle, this is where water is recycled. So water is the most abundant substance on Earth, and it's vital to all living things. The hydrosphere is an area of Earth where water moves and it is stored, and this is on or under a surface. And then residence time is the total time water molecules spend in a particular reservoir. The water cycle is driven by the sun's energy, which then warms Earth's surfaces and then leads to evaporation, which is where the liquid water turns to water vapor. Then there's sublimation, which is ice to vapor, which means something was very hot. And then condensation and precipitation, where the water vapor condenses into the clouds, leading to rain or snow. And then we also see surface runoff, snow melt, subsurface water flow, and stream flow. Here is an image of the water cycle. Feel free to pause and look at it. And then moving on to our carbon cycle. The carbon, as we all know, is the key element of life, because life is carbon-based, and it's the second most abundant molecule in all living things. And it has a biological cycle, and so this is because our terrestrial autotrophs obtain carbon through the intake of atmospheric carbon dioxide. Marine autotrophs do this through the dissolved carbonic acid that's from the water. And then carbon is passed to each trophic level in energy molecules, which use carbon as its backbone, so glucose. And then carbon is returned to the cycle again through exhalation of CO2 and then back into the atmosphere following the gas exchange resulting from the physiological processes, respiration. So carbon is then stored in a variety of ways, soil being a large one. It results from the decomposition of previously living organisms. They enter the cycle and then through leaching or runoff, and then some are taken up by plants. Rocks and minerals are also a great source of carbon because it enters the cycle through the weathering process. Once the rocks start to degrade, it's releasing that trapped carbon and it's going into the atmosphere. And then dissolved water. It has bicarbonate and carbonic acid, fossil fuels as well, decomposed remains of plants. All of these fossil fuels specifically are non-renewable resources, and that means it's a resource that reforms very slowly or not at all, and it cannot be reasonably replaced. So we need to be very careful with how we use these fossil fuels because there is a finite amount. And then a carbon sink, and we want to know what a carbon sink is because it's very important. A carbon sink is where large amounts of carbon are stored, and again, this is in soil and biomass. And our primary area that we see carbon sinks are forests because, one, there's a lot of soil, and two, there is a large amount of biomass, meaning large trees and other forms of plants on the canopy floor. And so they're all containing carbon. Here's a photo of the carbon cycle. And then the nitrogen cycle. So nitrogen fixing bacteria are vital to this process because most living things cannot convert atmospheric nitrogen. There are 5 key steps to the cycle. The first one is going to be nitrogen fixation. This is the conversion of atmospheric nitrogen to ammonia or ammonium. Then there's nitrification, which is the bacteria converting the ammonium to nitrates and nitrates. And then assimilation is where the plants absorb the nitrates and use it in building of various molecules, which are then consumed and passed on through the trophic levels. Then ammonification is the decay, where decomposers convert the organic nitrogen back to ammonium. And then denitrification is the anaerobic bacteria converting the ammonium back to gas, from which it's released to the atmosphere. And then feel free to pause for this one. And then the phosphorus and sulfur cycles, like I mentioned, we're not going to go too in depth in these, but they're also important for living things because they're considered essential nutrients. But their cycles can have negative effects on ecosystems. They can have dead zones, fallout, acid rain. All of these can destroy an ecosystem. And then again, later, these issues are going to be discussed in a later presentation, conservation biology. Here are our final objectives. I hope you learned something from this video. Make sure to watch our next videos that are upcoming so that you can stay up to date.